Mattias Desmet is a lecturer of psychoanalytic psychotherapy. I can barely read these words that he's a specialist in the Department of Psychoanalysis and Clinical Consulting at Ghent University in Belgium. He's the author of over 100 peer-reviewed academic papers, including this book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, and he's widely recognized as the world's leading expert on the theory of mass formation as it applies to the COVID-19 pandemic. Please welcome to the show, Mattias Desmet. Thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you, Jamie. Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here.
It's I just want to say that I've been looking for an explanation of what happened during COVID, because all my friends who used to be cynical skeptics of the government, of big pharma, of propaganda, of corporate media, all of a sudden turned their brains off. And worse than that, they started to repeat the propaganda. Worse than that, they started to shame people who were skeptical of the propaganda around COVID, around the numbers around COVID, around everything they were saying around COVID. Not only that did they shame those people, but then they tried with a virulence and an enthusiasm so these are people who are former skeptics, people who still don't think we landed on the moon and still think Elvis is alive, but somehow they had no questions over the COVID narrative. And if you did question it, you were outcast and a bad person and a eugenicist. And I was called everything in the world.
Eugenicist?
Yes. So you have a theory on how this happens. And in fact, you were studying this for a long time, and the conditions were just right for this to happen. So please, can you take all the time you want, explain your theory, and explain how former comedians who are supposed to be the chief skeptics in the world turned into the mouthpieces of propaganda, and not only that, but the fascist authoritarians that they turned into. And this isn't new. This happened in Nazi Germany. This happens a lot of times. You know all about it, so please take it away.
Yes, I believe what happened was a large-scale phenomenon of mass formation in our society. Mass formation is a specific kind of group formation, and you actually mentioned all the major characteristics. So one of the most important effects mass formation has at the level of individual psychological functioning is that it makes people incapable of taking a critical distance of what they believe in, first, and then second, that it makes people radically willing to sacrifice everything that used to be important for them. And then thirdly, maybe most important, is that it makes people, someone who is in the grip of this phenomenon of mass formation, starts to become radically intolerant for dissonant voices. And that's just the strange effects that the phenomenon of mass formation has at the level of individual psychological functioning. And this can go quite far. In the end, for instance, when talking about this intolerance for dissonant voices, this can go quite far. In the end, parents typically start to report their children to the state if they do not follow the state narrative well enough. This intolerance for dissonant voices goes very far. Well, indeed, in the beginning of the corona crisis, I started to study the statistics a little bit, and I immediately noticed that, well, in my opinion, in a strange way, while these statistics were really absurd in many respects, almost everyone just went along with the narrative. And I started to think about what happened, and it took me a few months because I really could pinpoint it, in my opinion, and understand that what was happening was this phenomenon of mass formation. And this is indeed, as you said, this mass formation typically emerges in a society when very specific conditions are met. And so one of the most important conditions is that many people have to feel lonely and isolated. They have to feel disconnected from their fellow human beings and disconnected from nature around them. So it's this state of isolation, of loneliness, sometimes also called the atomization of the human being, which is the root cause of the phenomenon of mass formation. And once people feel socially isolated, once they feel lonely, and this was really the case just before the corona crisis, worldwide, I mentioned the exact figure in my book, about 40% of the people worldwide reported to feel lonely, reported that they didn't have one meaningful relationship and that they only connected to people through the internet. So like in the States, the US Surgeon General mentioned that there was a loneliness epidemic. And in the UK, Theresa May appointed a minister of loneliness because she recognized how many people felt lonely and isolated.
Now you say that this loneliness, this has been coming on for hundreds of years, right? And that it's the mechanization of our society, and that, I think it even goes back to when Nietzsche said God is dead, right? So we only have science in a sense, and so we have what you refer to as free floating anxiety, and that set the table for mass formation, right? Correct? And this has been coming on.
Yes, that's exactly. So you see that there is a very strong correlation between the number of people feeling lonely in a country and the level of mechanization, industrialization, and use of technology in a country. So then that explains why. That explains exactly why throughout the last few centuries, more and more people started to feel lonely, and at the same pace, the phenomenon of mass formation got stronger and stronger and stronger. And it became so strong that in the beginning of the 20th century, for the first time, the mass formations, could seize control of the state apparatus, and the first totalitarian states emerged in the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany. So a totalitarian state is a state that is based on the phenomenon of mass formation. It's a state system which emerges after a mass formation. First, there is a small group of about 20 to 30% of the people who start to become fanatically in the grip of a certain narrative, a certain ideology, and that start to form a mass, and then, led by certain leaders, they can seize control of the state apparatus, and in this way, a totalitarian state emerges, which is a kind of state which does not only control public space and political space, as a classical dictatorship does, but which also controls private space, because it has a huge secret police, namely this part of the population that is in the grip of the mass formation and that so fanatically believes in the state narrative that they are willing to snitch on everyone, to report everyone to the state who doesn't follow the narrative close enough. So you see indeed that the root cause of the mass formation is the loneliness, which is somehow correlated to the level of mechanization of the world and the use of technology. And that's exactly the reason why more and more people started to feel lonely. And then, in a second step, once people feel lonely, they really start to struggle with a lack of meaning making in life. And once they feel lonely and struggle with a lack of meaning making, and this was also the case just before the corona crisis, for instance, worldwide, over 40% of the people worldwide reported that they considered their job to be a so-called bullshit job, a job which has no meaning at all. So that's huge.
Wow. That is huge. So, yes. But
and then can I just add something, Jim?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, and then that's very important. Once people feel disconnected from each other, struggle with a lack of meaning making, they really start to experience specific effects. In particular, they start to feel confronted with so-called free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression. That means a kind of anxiety, frustration, and aggression that is not connected to a mental representation, meaning that they are confronted with anxiety, frustration, and aggression, and at the same time don't know what they feel anxious, frustrated, and aggressive for. And that's the state. When a population is in that state, something very specific might happen. If under these conditions, someone or a narrative is disseminated, a narrative is distributed that indicates an object of anxiety, and at the same time provides a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety. For instance, lockdowns to deal with the virus, or the witch hunts to deal with the witches, or the crusades to deal with the Muslims in Jerusalem. If under these conditions, so this narrative is distributed, indicating an object of anxiety, and a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety, something very specific might happen. All this free-floating anxiety might at once connect to the object of anxiety, and there might be a huge willingness in the population to participate in a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety, even if this strategy is utterly absurd. And the reason is that in this way, people start to feel in control of their anxiety. They can connect it to something, and they have a strategy to deal with it. And at the same time, they can direct all their frustration and aggression on the object of anxiety. So that's the reason why, under certain conditions, many people follow this absurd strategy to deal with something their anxiety is connected to. And then in a second step, something even more important happens. And that's crucial, because so many people at the same time participate in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety. They have the feeling that they fight a collective, heroic battle with the object of anxiety. In other words, they feel connected again. They feel not lonely anymore. And that's why you have this strange feeling of connectedness and solidarity, which in the end is always fake. It's fake because a mass is a group that is formed not because people connect to each other. No, it's a group that is formed because people connect all separately to a collective ideal, meaning that in the end, they feel a lot of solidarity, not with each other, but with the collective. And the longer the mass formation exists, the less solidarity they feel for each other, the more solidarity they feel for the collective, meaning that in the end, they report each and everyone, they snitch on each and everyone of whom they think that he doesn't feel the narrative well enough, just like that, even when it concerns their own children or their own parents, it doesn't matter.
Now, Kurt grew up in, who's my co-host, and he grew up in kind of a cult-like atmosphere around religion, and it seems to resemble religion, right? The COVID narrative. And now here's my question for you. The people who this is what I don't get. I understand mass formation. I understand how most people go along, but the people who traditionally didn't go along,
their job,
the people, so the artists, right? So there are no bigger authoritarian Nazis around COVID than the arts, right? People on Broadway, people in Hollywood, they're the worst. And those are the people who are supposed to be pushing back. For instance, I had a close knit group of friends who, I don't know if you know what happened in America, but it's called Russiagate. It's when the Democratic Party and the intelligence community in America concocted its conspiracy theory that somehow Russia and Donald Trump colluded together to overthrow illegally the election of 2016. It was completely made up. And I had a group, and there's a lot, but most of the people in America believed it. I had a small knit group of people who debunked it, saw through it, and we were scorned by our friends over debunking it. They said, "What are you, a Trumper? Why do you like Donald Trump?" We're like, "That we don't like Donald Trump. We just don't like the intelligence community lying, and we're showing you the lies, and this is all a big distraction." And so even those, the reason I tell you this is because even those people who could see through that big mass delusion of Russiagate, and we became closer because of it, they turned on me. Even those people stopped their critical thinking skills when it came to COVID. Like they kept them when it came to Trump and it came to Russiagate and it came to everything. But when it came to COVID, they completely detached. They turned on me in the most vicious way possible, publicly. And all I was doing was being a consistent skeptic of the official establishment narrative, which is what I thought comedians were always supposed to be. And it turns out I was right. I was right at every turn. I got vaccine injured, and when I looked into the COVID narrative, they were lying about They were lying about the transmission and contraction. They were lying, which was the basis for mandates. So that's why they had to lie about them. And so they were lying about that. They were lying about natural immunity. They were lying about herd immunity. They were lying about masks. They were lying about efficacy. They were lying about, they didn't want to release the trial data for 75 years. And still my comedian friends didn't have one question about the COVID narrative. So how does that happen that the artists, the people who are supposed to be the people who push back, or people like Noam Chomsky, who became a complete monster during COVID, those are the people who I was so surprised. It's like, oh, that's how Hitler got it done, because the people who are supposed to push back didn't. So you can take it wherever you want.
I know it's a very well-known phenomenon that you're describing there. Joost Meerlo, the author of Rape of the Mind, coined the term mental surrender. He said, when a mass formation emerges in a society, many people who feel ideologically opposed normally to the narrative that leads to the mass formation will suddenly switch their minds, change their position, and go along with the narrative. So he calls this phenomenon mental surrender, a very typical phenomenon that happens time and time again when a mass formation emerges. And I believe that while we have seen a lot of massification, which are like a kind of precursors of mass formation, throughout the last 5 or 6 decades, the corona crisis was the first fully fledged phenomenon of mass formation since a very long time, and even the very first worldwide phenomenon of mass formation in history. And that's exactly when a mass emerges, when a mass formation happens, the energetic bonds in the masses are so strong that they split all pre-existing group formations in two. So the line dividing the people who went along with the narrative, with the corona narrative, and the people who didn't, really runs straight through every pre-existing group, like companies, friends, even families were split into by the mass formation. And that's typical for a fully fledged mass formation, for a real mass formation. It is so strong. The new bonds between the new group formation is so strong that it splits all pre-existing groups into, even political parties, companies, families, doesn't matter. It's all split into. So that's what happened, and that typically happens under the conditions that I just described. There must be a sufficient number of people, percentage of the population, that feels isolated, suffers from lack of meaning making, is confronted with a lot of anxiety, frustration, and aggression, and then this new group formation might emerge. And I think that's exactly what happened. And then there is always this small group of people who doesn't go along with the masses. This group of people is typically very heterogeneous. It comes from all different backgrounds, from all different ideological orientations, doesn't matter. And this small group of people really is just baffled by what happens, and it typically tries to wake up the masses.
Yes.
But it's very, yeah.
That's
it's very typically...
Go ahead, sorry.
Well, no, it very typically fails to do so. That is something that was already described in the 19th century by Gustave Le Bon, who wrote this wonderful book, The Psychology of the Crowd. And he said, like, when a mass emerges, there is always this group of people who is not sensitive for it, is not in the grip of the mass formation. And they typically try to wake up the people in the mass formation, typically try to show them how absurd the narrative is they believe in. And they typically fail to do so, he said. But, and that's extremely important, when this small group of people continues to speak out, continues to speak in a quiet way, they might not be able to wake up the masses, but they will prevent that the mass formation goes to this ultimate stage where the intolerance for dissonant voices is so strong that the masses typically start to discriminate, and in the end, eliminate each and everyone who doesn't go along with them, as if it is their ethical duty to do so. That's typical for the end stage of mass formation. And the end stage of mass formation, the masses start to become cruel towards the people who do not go along with them, and they do so as if it is their ethical duty to do so. So if this small group of people chooses to continue to speak out, it will prevent the masses to go to the last and ultimate stage of the mass formation. And that's what's the major mistake that the resistance did in Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Around 1930, the resistance stopped to speak out in the Soviet Union. Around 1935, they stopped to speak out in Nazi Germany. And within a period of 6 to 12 months, the cruelties started in this country. Just because at that moment, the group, the mass formation, which is a kind of a mass hypnosis, becomes complete. Because mass formation, just like mass hypnosis, which is more or less identical, is a phenomenon that is provoked by the voice of a leader. And when the voice of the leader is the only voice that can be heard, it's then that the mass formation goes to the last and ultimate stage. So continuing to speak out is just crucial. And also something else as well. The group who doesn't go along with the major mass formation might fall prey to a minor mass formation. And that's also something we should absolutely avoid, and which sometimes happened, I think.
So you talk about it as a hypnosis, that it's like, so when I see someone in May of 2023 in a comedy club wearing a mask and they're a 35-year-old healthy person, they're literally there's no difference between someone being hypnotized and what they're going through, right?
Well, the similarities are clear. In a hypnosis, someone's attention, so the person who is hypnotized, his attention is focused on a very small part of reality. That's what the hypnotist does. So he just draws away the attention, disconnects the attention of someone from the environment with a certain procedure, and then focuses all the attention on one small aspect of reality. And once the attention is focused on one small aspect of reality, it is as if the rest of reality doesn't exist anymore. This is an extremely strong phenomenon, which, for instance, can be used to perform surgical operations. Very typically, I wrote a Substack about that to show how throughout the last 2 centuries, this hypnosis was used during surgical operations, just because even when someone's attention is focused on one small aspect of reality, it is as if the rest of reality doesn't exist anymore, and the person even doesn't feel physical pain anymore. So that shows how extremely...
Really quick, I've heard you talk about how, and I experienced this during COVID. So I was the voice speaking out, and it's nice. Now some people are starting to recognize it. Last night I went to dinner. The guy at a restaurant bought us dinner because he said, keep speaking out. And I was like, oh, that's good. That made me feel good. But I didn't do it. I just did it because once I knew the truth, I couldn't. What else am I going to do? Go out there and lie? Right? That just blew my mind. But so I tried to. My whole point of my show became to tell people the truth about COVID, mostly that mandates were wrong because they weren't doing what people thought they did. They thought if everybody got vaccinated, it would stop the pandemic. And if everybody got vaccinated, there wouldn't be any COVID outbreaks in our country. And that was never the case. And that's what I kept showing, that the countries around the world that had the highest vaccine update were having some of the highest outbreaks. And so this is before we knew that they never tested for transmission of the virus. That's before I figured it out just on the data. And so me showing people data didn't make a difference, right? So talk about that. Talk about how if you try to change people's minds during one of these things and you use data, which is what I was doing. I was trying to use actually science and data, that will have no effect on them. Can you speak
Jimmy,
to that?
The word of God convicts your heart, not your head.
Okay. So could you speak to that?
Yes. Rational arguments usually don't make a difference. That's very typical. So that was also described by Gustave Le Bon in the 19th century already. That the rational arguments absolutely are not sufficient to wake someone up who is in a mass formation. But of course, we have to distinguish between three groups, I think. So like the group who is really in the grip of the mass formation usually is rather small. It's only about 20 to 30% of the population. But then there is a 65% of the people who just go along with the masses and who always remain silent. They feel that there is something wrong with the narrative but they just prefer to remain silent because in one way or another they maybe don't find the courage to speak out, or they just take the easy way and do as if they agree with the masses. And then there is a small group of people, usually rather small, 1 to 5%, maybe sometimes 10%, it depends on the circumstances, who sees that there is something wrong, who feels that there is something wrong with the narrative, and who tries to speak out. And indeed, this small group might have an impact through rational argumentation on the middle group. That's possible, but usually not on the group who is really in the grip of the mass formation. So I think in any case, it's always important that we continue to speak out, but we should realize that we might fail, or we might not succeed to wake up the people. And at the same time, and that's just crucial, we should understand that it is not because we do not succeed in waking up the masses that our voice does not have an effect. Our voice does have an effect. It prevents that people go deeper and deeper in the mass formation. So that's just, once you understand that we always have to continue to speak out without expecting that we will convince someone. And if we continue to do so, we will have an effect. And at the same time, as I just said, we also should be aware always that we do not fall prey to a different mass formation ourselves, because also in the group who doesn't go along with a major mass formation, also this group struggles with a lot of anxiety, frustration, and aggression in this situation, because they just feel threatened in one way or another. And this group might also fall prey to certain narratives which attribute all anxiety and all danger to one specific small object, while the situation is usually much more complex than that.
I experienced that. I experienced that with my group that were, proud that we were Russiagate debunkers. And they immediately, exactly what you said. It's like all that anxiety that they had around that from being on the outside of the mainstream, they just focused on COVID narrative, and it was fear, fear, fear. I've never seen anything like it. And if you want to disconnect someone's rational thinking or critical thinking skills, put it that way, you just find their fear point, and they found it. And, people who I know, personal comedians who are diabetics, who complained about the corruption of our government by the big pharma and why their diabetes medicines cost so much more here than in other countries, and how they're all corrupted. And then as soon as COVID came and vaccines, they were like, nope, not one question. Not only did they not have a question, but they wouldn't allow me to have a question. And if I had a question, and can you talk about the you mentioned it earlier, but talk about they were so vicious in the character assassination of me and people like me, but you talk about it. You say they saw it as their moral duty to do so. Can you talk about that psychology?
Yeah, of course. Well, this mass formation actually. So we always have to understand that. The origin of mass formation is the terrible psychological state a population is in before the mass formation starts. Mm-hmm. This means that they feel lonely, struggle with lack of meaning making, suffer from all this anxiety, frustration, and aggression. Then the mass formation emerges, and it seems as if all these things disappeared. They feel connected again. They have a new meaning in life, like to fight the virus. All their anxiety is connected to an object. They can control it, and they can direct all their frustration and aggression at one point. And if they meet someone who doesn't agree and who tries to show them that the narrative that led to the mass formation just is absurd, they feel threatened, because they feel that if they allow that person to speak to them, they will wake up and they will be confronted with all this pre-existing misery again. So that's why they feel, and also, that's why they start they try to make the dissonant voice shut up. That's what they why they just can't stand the dissonant voice, and at the same time they consider it their holy duty, because they feel that this person who doesn't go along with the masses, who doesn't go along with the narrative, must be an egoist. He lacks solidarity. He lacks this new citizenship, which is so typical for the masses, because they feel connected again in the masses, and thus they feel a lot of solidarity and they feel a new citizenship. And if there is someone who doesn't go along with them, this must be someone who is not really a human being. And who should be destroyed in the end, who deserves to be destroyed.
That's how people who knew me for 30 years, that's exactly almost the language they use, that I should be destroyed, that I was doing this out of ego and I didn't care about anybody and had nothing to do. Again, but as we talk about it, I could show them facts and it didn't matter. People who knew me 30 years did this kind of thing. And of course, I don't want to make it about myself, but I've been dying to talk to you about this because of it. Kurt, you want to ask a question?
People are more rabid than after 9/11 when we had that whole solidarity for that bad idea that we did. I think there was less persecution heaped on and there was a lot.
Right.
I think it was less than this one. I think there was more here.
And
I've
COVID,
never heard someone say, don't do your own research.
I've never heard some people would say in America, comedians on stage would shame people for doing your own research. And they would say stuff like, trust the science. Well, you don't trust the science before first you examine it skeptically. That's what you're supposed to do. What they wanted you to do was have blind faith in science, which is what you have in religion. That's not what you have in science. Science works by questioning it. Science loves to be questioned. It's a lie that can't stand scrutiny. And so that's how they mix those two things together. Trust science, have faith in science. That's not how science works. That's called blind faith. And so I just never, honest to God, I cannot convey the most, how nothing blew my mind more than to see almost the entire comedy community, or the parts that I saw of it anyway, in unison, shaming people for reading, for trying to get informed about an experimental medical treatment they're being forced to take. And if you want to know what's in that vaccine, or if you want to see the data or want to have any skepticism or questions, you're a how dare you? You are the Nazi. Obviously being ignorant to the fact that they're the Nazis, like Chomsky was completely ignorant to the fact that what he was doing, he should have been tipped off to, because they did it in World War II. They forced medical treatments on people without informed consent, which is why that's a war crime. And Chomsky famously likes to shame every president since World War II. He says they're all war criminals, and he's right about that. But guess who also pushed for a war crime? Noam Chomsky, because forcing a medical treatment on someone without informed consent goes against the Nuremberg trial. So he became the thing he thought he's been criticizing his whole life. They just had to find the fear button in Chomsky's brain. They pressed it, and he became an authoritarian monster. So I don't know where let's just change the subject very quickly. And here's another thing, like, you're not allowed to question the science, right, around COVID, but I found out through you that 85% of academic research pretty unreliable, correct?
Yes, well, in certain domains, yes. In 2005, the so-called replication crisis started in the academic world, and it showed, or at least certain authors, among whom, for instance, the famous John Ioannidis of Stanford, he described how in certain academic domains, such as the medical sciences, up to 85% of the publications of the findings cannot be reproduced. So, which means that from a scientific point of view, they are not objective, and they are more or less useless in most cases. So it's a huge percentage, yes, 85%. John Ioannidis wrote some wonderful papers about it. One of the papers was titled "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False," and I indeed believe that this is one of the major problems we have in our society. We all have a blind belief in science and in the academic world, or in something that calls itself science, but that in most cases actually just is not accurate. So indeed, that's a huge problem. I think we should reconsider our blind belief in what we believe science is today.
For instance, speaking to this very point, can you tell me how long is the coastline of England?
Yes, I mentioned that somewhere in the third chapter of my book. Indeed, nobody can measure the coastline of Great Britain. That's something very typical. We all believe that we can measure almost everything, but that's just not true. Most phenomena cannot be measured, and that's one of the the coastline of Great Britain cannot be measured because it's intrinsically two-dimensional. It shows a lot of curves, and every time you try to reduce it to a straight line, it doesn't work. So the smaller your measurement unit, the longer the coastline of Great Britain will be. That's typical, and that's one of the major problems I think we deal with. We think that everything can be studied in an objective way, but that's actually not true.
I can measure it. It's one Great Britain long. Done. Just fix a measurement. Easy.
There it is. So
I think can I add one thing to that?
Yeah.
I think in the end, and that's the analysis that I present in my book. I think that in the end, the problem of mass formation and of totalitarianism is rooted in our rationalist view on man and the world. That's what I explain in my book. That's what I explain in my book.
So this part I really want to talk about. This needs at least 2 hours, but let's talk about it. So this is where I think people like you talk about the since the Enlightenment and we've become more mechanized and people have that creates free floating anxiety, and so it's because the way our culture is now, everything's cause and effect, right? If I can't measure it, then it doesn't exist, right? And Carl Jung spent a lot of time talking about a collective unconscious, and that you can't, like for instance, where artists and poets get their inspiration from, it can't come. A lot of it doesn't come right from direct experience from their life. It comes from somewhere else, and he posited that it comes from a collective unconscious, which we all share, which we all do share. And so, people who just think rationally, rational thinking doesn't equal reality necessarily. And can you explain what I mean by that?
I will try to. Yes, on the one hand, science is an accumulation of rational knowledge. But on the other hand, science is also a certain practice which showed us that the essence of life and the essence of reality can never be understood in a rational way. And that's what many people forget. Like Niels Bohr, to give only one example, after Niels Bohr was a Nobel Prize winning physicist who studied the behavior of elementary particles, atoms, for instance, throughout his entire life. And in the end, he said, when it comes to atoms, language can only be used as poetry, because he acknowledged, and he was dead serious when he said that, he acknowledged that in the end, what we call matter, elementary particles, just doesn't behave in a rational way. And it took me personally until I was 35 years old before I really understood that. I was taking a deep dive into the mathematical basis of complex dynamical systems theory, and I just suddenly understood that all complex dynamical systems behave as an irrational number. For instance, they have no periodicity, and that makes them fundamentally unpredictable. And I suddenly started to understand what all these great scientists meant when they concluded that in the end, life and everything around us cannot be understood in a rational way, that the essence of life can never be reduced to the categories of our rational, logical understanding. Meaning that if we try to reduce life to the categories of our rational and logical understanding, we will always destroy life. And that's so in a certain part of life or a certain part of reality can be understood in a rational way, but the essence always escapes rational understanding. So, and that's also why I think once you start to really be humble enough to admit that your rational brain, your rational understanding will never be capable of grasping the essence of life, it's at that moment I really believe that when we think in a logical way, we really connect the one idea to the other and we build a wall around us, almost literally a wall which isolates us from the music of life around us, from the eternal music of life around us. And then we can stop our rational understanding, when we can stop being convinced that everything around us can be reduced to our own logical understanding, it's at that moment that the building blocks of this wall slide a little bit away from each other, and that the eternal music of life can go through the wall and touch the strings of our being, almost literally of our body. And that's, I think that it is at that moment that you, in one way or another, participate in something eternal outside of you, something that you can never understand, but that will always be there. And it is at that moment, I think, that you also start to be less scared of everything related to death and dying in the end of life, for instance. And that's just because you feel that you're connected to something that transcends rational understanding and that has an eternal nature. And I think that that also shows what the major problem is in our Enlightenment society, because we try to control, to understand, control, and manipulate everything in a rational way. We start to become very scared of death and dying, and we just cannot tolerate the idea anymore
of mystery.
Yeah, the mystery in life. Yes,
life is a mystery, and then people come along like who I'm a fan of, Sam Harris, and there's no mystery. It's all A plus B equals C, and you talked about that quantum physicist, and there's a thing called the measurement. He talks about how elements and particles don't act rationally. Well, there's this experiment they do. I think it's called the measurement problem. So they fire electrons through a slit in the paper, and they're supposed to go right where you think they would go on the back wall.
The slit experiment with waves and particles.
So the particle, right?
And you observe them, and they look different.
So if you when you look at them, they go right where you think they're supposed to go. But if you don't put your consciousness on them, they go everywhere. They act irrationally.
Right.
And so that's what I think that's the underlies everything in the universe is irrational.
But this thing happened with COVID. If they were being rational, like they said, there wouldn't be a statement like trust the science.
That's right. That's irrational.
Where you turned it into something mystical.
That's right. They did.
Don't read it like I'm in a goddamn church in medieval times.
That's the irony, huh?
We're gonna go trust the science. Like, go ahead and act all rational and don't believe in anything. I don't care. Do that, but just don't call it science at me.
That's right. That's so they did under the guise of being rational, they became mystics and they turned scientists.
I got out of a thing because it bothered me having to be, in a thing like that where I have do you want to stumble your brother from the one true faith with your questions?
Yeah.
So I get real triggered by it everywhere. And what I discovered was I can never escape it. Everywhere I go, except instead of a church, it's going to be your employment and all. We're all doing, and then now you see all these companies with their culture minister or manager, not minister, but everybody line up. We're all going to wave our hands in the air. We're not raising your pay, but we're all going to form a family.
That's right.
Doing these dumb activities, and they're all doing it now. Probably spending money to just give the employees to get them in that culty, trust the company, because that's what trust the science means. It means the science that was handed to you.
That's right.
By these two companies. Trust it. Don't look into it.
Trust the company. Yes, it does.
Someone's too stupid to research. Guess what? They're not going to research. So they're saying it to people who can read.
But that is such a big idea that you touch on about that the basis of life doesn't act rational, and that you do become less afraid. I know I have become less afraid of death. Knowing that I'm connected to something eternal. And that time only exists in this level of consciousness, and that we are connected to a collective consciousness that knows no time. And people who miss that, I think, are missing out on life. Don't you think so?
Yes, I think to a certain extent I agree. I just want to say something about the experiment you referred to before I go into the last question. It's a double slit experiment.
That's
you referred to. Yes, and it shows that when you observe an elementary particle, it behaves like a particle, but when you do not observe it, it behaves like a wave, which is something completely different. So, indeed, that's one of the most important experiments in quantum physics. But then exactly, I also think that we can know life in two different ways, I think. We can know it in a rational way, and we can know it by resonating with it, which is something completely different. And I think I really think we should walk the path of rationality as far as possible. I really think we should push our rational understanding of the world to the utter limit. But at that moment, we should be honest enough and humble enough to admit that sooner or later we arrive at the border of our rational understanding, and that we have to switch to a different way of knowing the world in, and that we can only do that by resonating with it. And actually, I think that it is this capacity to resonate with a certain phenomenon that is also the basis and the origin of science. René Thom, one of the most famous mathematicians of the 20th century, had this wonderful quote. I will just try to repeat it, but it will not be literally. But he said, I think that what distinguishes a scientist from most people is not that he has this extraordinary capacity to think in a rational way, but that he has this extraordinary capacity to get into the skin of things, to resonate with things, and to understand them from within. So that's a different way of understanding the world. And I think that the essence of life, we can resonate with the essence of life, but we can never know it in a rational way. And it is this resonance which connects us to the essence of life. And we can start resonating with things outside of us if we are capable of leaving our ego behind, and if we are capable to stop to think in a rational way. So that's something very strange. Yes. I think that's the major leap forward that our society has to take. It has to understand that rational thinking can never be the cornerstone of society and can never grasp the essence of life, and that we have to move on to a different way of connecting to each other and to the world around us.
That's some very profound stuff. That's great stuff. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Really exciting. I'm glad you were willing to come on the show and our audience got to hear you. It's really fantastic. Everybody check out his book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism. Thanks to my guest, Mattias Desmet. I really appreciate you coming on. I hope we can talk again soon.
Me too, Jimmy. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you very much.
Check out my new stand-up special, COVID Lies Are Funny, at jimmydore.com. Only $10. Become a premium member. We're going to be on tour in Northampton, Massachusetts, Syracuse, Cohoes, New York, Hartford, Los Angeles, Bakersfield, California, Baltimore, Maryland, and San Francisco, California. Plus, did we say Chicago? There's lots of stuff. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets. See you there.